The true terror wasn't the blackness that consumed the horizon. The true terror was the silence. I was in my workshop, the air conditioner rattling its death rattle, a soldering iron fizzing against cold metal. Normal sounds. Then, the hiss of the AC cut out, not because the power went, but as if the sound waves themselves had been sucked into a void. The rattle died. The soldering iron's sizzle vanished, leaving only a faint visual shimmer. I blinked, confused. I tapped my workbench. Tap, tap. The sound was dull, dead, as if the air had turned to concrete. I looked out the window. The rolling, impenetrable black cloud I'd been watching for an hour wasn't just the thickest fog Oakhaven had ever seen. It was anti-sound. It was a blanket of pure sensory deprivation, and it was swallowing the coast whole. I grabbed my tools, my heart hammering a rhythm that, thank God, only I could hear. I'm Arthur Vance. I came to Oakhaven for the quiet, ironically. My former life in the city was drowning in the static of perpetual noise, traffic, chatter, a billion competing frequencies. As an acoustician, I developed a crippling sensitivity to it all. So I bought this remote shack by the coast, near the disused Lighthouse, and surrounded myself with equipment designed to map and monitor sound, from the deepest infrasound to the highest ultrasonic whine. I craved the purity of the ocean's roar and the wind's song. Now, the ocean roar was gone. The wind's song was gone. I stood on the porch, a flashlight beam swallowed by the swirling blackness, 10 feet away. The miasma had arrived in a matter of minutes, a visible, moving wall of shadow that rolled over the cliff face and into town. It wasn't gray, white, or even brown. It was pure, unholy black, a visual vacuum that felt heavy and corrosive. My only neighbor, old Mrs. Peterson, lived 50 yards down the unpaved road. I tried shouting. "Mrs. Peterson, are you inside?" My own voice felt like a wet cough, flat and immediately choked off. The sound didn't carry, it died. This wasn't weather. This was a violation of physics. I retreated inside, slamming the heavy wooden door, the sound a pathetic thud that provided no comfort. The power grid predictably had collapsed. I switched on my emergency generator and flipped the circuits to my main console. Thank goodness for batteries and backups. The core of my studio, a bank of equalizers, frequency analyzers, and a massive custom-built microphone array, flickered to life. I flipped the dial to monitor low-frequency sound. What I got back wasn't just static, it was an unmistakable, deep-throated hum. I felt it in my chest before I heard it with my ears. It was a rhythmic, pulsing thrum below the range of human hearing, a subsonic pressure wave that felt like a migraine pressing on my lungs. My equipment confirmed it, a persistent, powerful signal at 19 hertz. The miasma is broadcasting. I worked through the night, hunched over the schematics, trying to find a natural source. Geophysical activity? Submarine? No. This signal was too uniform, too deliberate. It was a biological frequency. By 3 a.m., the hum was intensifying, making the air in the shack feel thick and difficult to breathe. I had to know if the town itself was safe. I rigged a powerful battery to one of my custom directional microphones and a pair of industrial-grade noise-canceling headphones. If sound didn't travel, I could listen through the vibrations in the air and structures. I slipped out into the oppressive miasma. It smelled metallic and faintly sweet, like ozone and rotting wood. I stayed low, my old oil lantern casting a pathetic circle of dull yellow light that seemed to strain against the consuming black. I walked toward the center of Oakhaven, the main strip where the few shops and the old library stood. As I approached the square, I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone, a sound no human should ever make. It wasn't a hammer. It was too soft, too rhythmic, too close to the ground. It was a measured bone-on-stone percussion. I pressed the high-gain headphones tighter to my ears. The sound was coming from the lobby of the Oakhaven Bank, a stout granite building. I crept to the window, peering through the gloom. A figure was inside. It was Mr. Davies. The fungus wasn't just infecting. It was using the nervous system like an antenna. If this fungal network was driven by low-frequency vibration, the only way to destroy it, to utterly break the communication, would be to hit it with its absolute opposite, an overwhelming, targeted, ultrasonic pulse. Not a chemical agent, but a sonic weapon. I thought of the materials needed: high-output amplifier, custom transducer array, a powerful frequency generator. I had pieces, but not the power or the broadcast range. Then I looked out my window, past the swirling, unnatural fog, up the massive crumbling cliff face. Looming over the town, its silent glass lens covered in salt and grime, was the Oakhaven Lighthouse. It was built a century ago to withstand hurricanes and broadcast its warning for miles. It was powered by a dedicated, massive diesel engine and, most importantly, housed the original Class A foghorn. A relic of a past age, that horn was designed to produce a sound pressure level that could pierce miles of pea soup fog. It was, essentially, a gigantic, highly durable acoustic weapon. If I could get to it, power its engine, and re-engineer its sound chamber to produce the ultrasonic frequency I needed, that was the new objective. Not to fortify and hide, but to fight sound with sound. The generator sputtered outside, its noise suddenly feeling like a beacon in the unnatural silence. I spent the next hour preparing. I wrapped my precious microphone array in oilskins. I scavenged the workshop, finding a heavy brass nautical lantern. It gave off a bright, steady, comforting light, which I immediately had to cover and seal with electrical tape, leaving only a tiny shielded slit to illuminate the ground. Light was now a danger, not a comfort. I needed to move in darkness and silence. My weapon? Not a rifle, not a crowbar. I strapped a heavy sledgehammer across my back. It was quiet, effective, and perfectly suited for creating an impact when necessary. And the sudden shock of percussion might momentarily scramble an already vibration-sensitive creature. I looked at the map of Oakhaven, a simple tourist-drawn chart pinned to my wall. The lighthouse was a mile away, a treacherous upward climb through the narrow, twisting streets. I unbolted the door. The miasma waited, black and suffocating. I paused, listening not with my ears but with my chest. The hum, the 19 hertz signal, was all-consuming. It was the sound of the parasite breathing. Then, from somewhere deep in the fog-choked streets of Oakhaven, I heard the sound that sealed my fate. It was the tapping again, not the slow, rhythmic cadence of Mr. Davies, but a frantic, rapid-fire percussion. It was faster, closer, and answered by another fainter tapping from a different direction. They were communicating. They were organizing. The hunting had begun. I took a deep breath, adjusted the sledgehammer, and stepped out into the crushing velvet silence. My mission: reach the lighthouse, fire the horn, break the sound. The only way to survive the silence was to make the loudest, deadliest noise possible. The miasma was colder than it looked. It didn't feel like air. It felt like walking through a cloud of wet sand. Every breath was thin and metallic. My brass lantern, heavily taped and shielding its light, cast a useless, sickly orange glow on the ground directly beneath my boots. The light felt wrong. A clumsy, arrogant signal of my presence in this world that had decided to embrace the dark. The hum, the constant subsonic thrumming at 19 hertz, was now the only consistent thing in existence. It felt like a low-grade earthquake trapped inside my skull, vibrating my teeth. I had to consciously tune it out, focusing instead on the tapping I'd heard earlier. It was still there, faint but present, moving across the pavement 2 blocks over. Tap, 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 tap. Slow, deliberate. They weren't running, they were patrolling, and they were listening. I pressed the directional microphone against the exterior wall of a corner store. Through the headphones, the world came alive with unnatural sound. The wind, which my naked ear couldn't hear, registered as a low, hissing static. The hum was a booming drum, and beneath it all, the silent ones were communicating. The tapping intensified as one figure passed close to the wall. It was a language of percussion, transmitted through the ground, through the foundations, through the air itself. I realized with sickening clarity, they don't need ears to listen. They feel the vibrations. My heavy boots were a liability. I shed them, tying my thick wool socks tight around my feet. Better traction, better silence. The cold was instantly brutal, but the sound reduction was worth it. I moved forward, a ghost in the fog, the weight of the sledgehammer resting cool against my spine. I passed what had been in a neighborhood. A child's tricycle lay on its side, the wheels motionless. A shadow, darker than the miasma, stretched across the pavement. It was a car, doors ajar, interior coated in the same faint, sweet-smelling black dust that covered everything. I avoided looking into the car. I didn't want to see what might be sitting there, motionless, waiting. I had to keep reminding myself, they hate the light. They are drawn to noise and heat. My entire body was now a ticking clock of warmth and vibration. The town library, a solid brick fortress that smelled perpetually of old paper and dust motes, stood near the center of the square. It was directly on the fastest path to the cliffs leading up to the lighthouse. I crept to the main entrance. The huge wooden doors were slightly ajar, a black slit in the brick. I paused, listening. Silence. Just the hum. I gently pushed the door open, slipping inside. The moment I entered, the air changed. The miasma inside was denser, thicker, almost oily, and the silence was absolute. I was in a vacuum. I took 3 cautious steps toward the main reading room, and then I heard the sound that told me I was trapped. Rapid fire, staccato, coming from the balcony above. It wasn't patrolling. It was excitement. I froze, heart hammering. I quickly angled my shielded lantern, pointing the tiny sliver of light at the floor. A wave of movement swept across the room. 6 figures were standing between the long rows of shelves. The silent ones. They weren't looking at me. They were looking at the light. Their forms were gaunt, draped in torn clothing. They moved with a horrific, jerky grace, their limbs snapping into position. But the true horror was their heads. They were bowed low, their faces pressed deep into their chests, their necks bent at grotesque angles, actively trying to hide their eyes. The tapping came again, a desperate, frantic pulse, and 2 of them broke rank, sliding along the floor toward me, using their elongated hands to pull themselves forward. I saw their eyes then, as one of them briefly lifted its head. A split second of movement, a patch of its skin pulled away from the eye socket. It wasn't an eyeball inside. It was a cluster of pale, bioluminescent fungal masses. They pulsed with a faint greenish glow, like deep-sea organisms. They were exquisitely sensitive, and they were pointed right at me. They weren't blind. They were just overwhelmed by any light source stronger than their own internal glow. My tiny sliver of lantern light was a siren. I drew the sledgehammer, not for a killing blow, but to create a distraction. I swung the head of the hammer against the metal leg of a nearby desk. The sound was shockingly loud in the silence. The hum seemed to momentarily waver. The 2 charging silent ones immediately convulsed. They stumbled, crashing into a shelf, the noise sending dust motes scattering. The others shielded their heads with their arms, their rhythmic tapping breaking into a series of pained, guttural chirps, the sound of the fungus itself reacting to the aggressive sonic shockwave. It gave me the opening I needed. I didn't waste time with the hammer. I turned and sprinted back the way I came, slamming the library doors shut behind me. I didn't stop until I was 3 blocks away, lungs burning, the terrible, frantic chirping still echoing in my headphones. The sledgehammer worked. A sudden, massive percussive shock scrambled their already hypersensitive system. But it was a temporary fix, and it only bought me seconds. I reached the old police station, a squat, solid building 2 blocks from the base of the Lighthouse path. This was my last chance for cover before the open ascent. The miasma here felt different, thinner. I paused, consulting my gear. The hum, the oppressive 19 hertz drone, was suddenly intermittent. It was spiking, dropping, almost stuttering. A massive magnetic spike ripped through my headphones. Then the hum went completely dead for 2 full seconds. Silence. True silence. It was deafening. Then the power came back, the hum returning with a vengeance, but something was wrong. It was off frequency, now hovering near 21 hertz, then violently snapping back to 19. The parasite's broadcast was being disrupted, but by what? I heard a different sound then, faint and mechanical. A sound I desperately recognized, a generator. And it wasn't outside, it was coming from inside the police station. I moved to the back alley. A steel service door was barricaded with filing cabinets and sandbags. A crudely cut vent hole was covered with thick mesh, and a stream of warm, moist air was being exhausted. The hum stuttered again, and a voice, rough, male, and distorted by the heavy air, came from the vent. "Keep that damn frequency dampener on. They're sensitive today." I dropped my gear and hammered on the steel door. "Hey, I need to talk to you. I'm a survivor." The speaking stopped instantly. The generator noise continued, but the venting air ceased. I heard the rasp of metal on metal, a weapon being loaded. "Go away," a woman's voice whispered through the door, sharp and terrified. "We're closed. We're not taking anyone." "Wait, I'm Arthur Vance. I'm the acoustic engineer from the coast. I know what the sound is. I know what to do." I was shouting now, desperate. "You're messing with the hum. That's why they're active. You're driving them crazy. You need to let me in." A bolt slid back. The heavy door groaned open just enough to reveal a sliver of light from inside. A single, harsh, red light bulb hanging from the ceiling. A muzzle of an old shotgun was thrust into the gap, followed by a pair of wary, intelligent eyes belonging to a middle-aged man with a graying beard and a badge pinned to a dirtied shirt. This was Chief Elias Dane. He hadn't left Oakhaven when everyone else did. Vance, the nut with the microphones, Elias grunted, lowering the gun slightly. I thought you ran off. How the hell do you know about the frequency? I mapped it. It's 19 hertz. It's the parasite's central nervous system. I can break it. But I need to get to the lighthouse, I pleaded. Elias hesitated, looking past me into the churning black miasma. He smelled of sweat, copper, and desperation. He slid the shotgun back. Get in. Fast. Don't bring the miasma with you. I stumbled inside the cramped station office. The door slammed shut behind me, the bolts slamming home. The room was heavy with the smell of old coffee and fear. 3 people were there. 1, Elias Dane, the police chief. Built like a brick, exhausted, but his eyes were sharp and focused on survival. 2, Martha, 50s, the town's retired librarian. She was hunched over a work table covered in salvaged radio components and books, her hands methodical and precise. She wore thick wool gloves, and her glasses were smudged, but she held herself with a fierce academic calm. 3, Sam, 18, a nervous, lanky boy, a former gas station attendant. He was tending the generator, his face pale and eyes darting. The hum was low here, almost undetectable. I looked toward the source of the magnetic interference. It was an antique shortwave radio set up in the corner, humming loudly. Martha had stripped its copper coils and run them to a crudely constructed barrier, a low wall of iron and aluminum sheets that surrounded the room. It's a Faraday cage, Arthur, Martha explained, her voice steady, but poor quality. The copper coils are broadcasting static in the 18 to 22 hertz range. It's scrambling the signal they're using to communicate, but only in this small area. It's draining the battery quickly, though. She was brilliant. She had intuitively understood the nature of the threat, a communications-based parasite. It's not just scrambling the signal, I corrected, pulling out my gear and setting up my analyzer. It's antagonizing them. They communicate with the taps. The 19 hertz hum is the command center. Your rig is causing acoustic dissonance in their network. It's making them frantic and disorganized, but it's also drawing their attention like blood in the water. Elias scowled, wiping the sweat from his brow. Dissonance. Great. So we're just ringing the dinner bell with a poorly built metal fence. Exactly, I said, pointing to my analyzer. The frequency readout was a chaotic scribble. We can't fight a symphony of silence with a squeak of static. We need to go big. We need to go supersonic. I explained the Lighthouse plan, the size of the horn, the dedicated power plant, the need for a massive, focused ultrasonic pulse, a sound so high frequency and intense it would burn the fungal network out of the host's nervous systems. Elias listened, his face grim. Martha, however, leaned closer, her eyes gleaming with scientific intrigue. An acoustic weapon. Brilliant, she murmured, already sketching equations on a notepad. The Lighthouse's diaphragm is tuned for maximum compression at low to mid frequency. We'd have to completely rebuild the transducer. We need something that can handle a massive surge of ultrasonic power. I nodded, desperation rising in my throat. I have the schematics, but I don't have the materials. Not here. I need an industrial-grade neodymium magnet and enough fine copper wiring to handle the current surge. Elias looked around the cramped office. We stripped everything valuable out of the station 3 days ago. There's nothing left but rusty locks and police records. I spun to Martha, who had the look of a hunter catching a scent. The Oakhaven Technical School, she said, tapping the desk. It was closed for renovation. They had a huge industrial MRI machine installed for testing purposes. It had the most powerful magnetic core in the county. It was pure neodymium, bolted down in a heavy, separate building on the north side of town. Elias cursed under his breath. The technical school is 3 miles in the wrong direction. We'd have to go through the mouth to get there. The mouth? I asked, looking at the map. Elias pointed a thick, trembling finger to a spot on the map, a narrow, fog-choked canyon road that was the only route around the river gorge. It's where the miasma first hit land. It's thickest there. We saw the first of them there. They move slow, but they're always gathered there. It's the feeding ground, Elias whispered. But the MRI magnet was our only chance. Without it, The lighthouse plan was dead. We'd just be turning a huge rusty beacon into a slightly louder dinner bell. I looked at the window, the black miasma pressing close, and I heard the tapping again, faster and more excited than before. Their hunters were closing in on the magnetic dissonance of our makeshift cage. "We go now," I said, checking the straps on the sledgehammer. "If we wait, they'll figure out what we're doing." We hit the technical school, get the magnet, and get to the lighthouse. It's the only way to stop the hum. Elias nodded slowly, his hand resting on the shotgun. "Fine, but we move in pairs. Martha, you're the brain. I'm the gun. Vance, you're the ears. Sam stays here and keeps the cage running. If we aren't back by dawn, he kills the power and runs for the hills." Martha was already gathering her tools. "We need to work fast. A magnet of that size, we're talking about 30 minutes just to unbolt it. We need an entry team and a cover team." We were 6 hours from dawn. 6 hours to travel 3 miles through a town saturated with silence and death, break into a high-security building, dismantle a complex machine, and drag a massive magnet back to the police station. And all while the hum drove the silent ones into a hunting frenzy. I felt the adrenaline surge. Not fear, but a cold, focused clarity. The engineer in me was back online, calculating velocity, stress loads, and most importantly, frequency. The lighthouse was waiting. But first we had to brave the mouth. We moved out an hour before the generator was scheduled for its next refueling cycle, leaving Sam alone with the dwindling battery power and the oppressive silence. Elias, Martha, and I were a tight unit. Elias led, shotgun held low, his movements heavy but precise. Martha walked close behind, her backpack stuffed with tools and the crude magnetic copper coils she'd salvaged. I brought up the rear, the sledgehammer a solid, reassuring weight, using my shielded mic to listen. The hum was still erratic, peaking and dropping, thanks to Martha's cage, which meant the silent ones were confused, but agitated. This was our window. The walk to the north side of Oakhaven was a study in profound decay. We skirted neighborhoods where the miasma had seeped through cracked windows, and the black fungal dust lay heavy on everything. The houses themselves seemed to be sagging, covered in a velvet-like black mold that absorbed the meager ambient light. Finally, we reached the approach to the technical school. It lay across the gorge, accessible only via a winding, shadowed road known locally as the Mouth. The atmosphere here was violently different. The miasma wasn't just fog. It was a physical force pressing in from the river canyon below, thick and opaque. The stench was overwhelming, a combination of ozone, wet metal, and something sickly sweet, like decaying flower blossoms. Elias stopped, raising a hand. We dropped to one knee. My headphones suddenly went ballistic. The hum wasn't just loud, it was screaming at 19 hertz, overriding Martha's attempts to jam it. The parasitic signal was intensely concentrated here. "They're nesting," Elias hissed, his voice barely audible over the internal thrumming. Then the tapping started. Not the random patrolling rhythm, but a unified, complex, and rapid percussion, like 1,000 dry sticks striking concrete, all at once. It rose and fell in waves, a horrible alien language. Martha, peering through her thick glasses in the blackness, whispered, "They're organized. They're communicating movement patterns. They sense the high energy field here." We needed to cross a 90-foot stretch of open asphalt before the road entered a series of sharp switchbacks leading up to the school. The asphalt was covered in a slick black residue. "Vance, give me a status," Elias ordered, his hand shaking slightly on the shotgun pump. I pressed the microphone deep into the pavement. The feedback in my headphones was agonizing. I count 6 distinct taps ahead. 2 are stationary. 4 are patrolling. They're using the low rumble of the gorge to mask their movements. 6 targets. Too many for silence, Elias decided. He looked at Martha, who was already running calculations in her head. "I need a distraction," I stated. "A loud, sudden acoustic blast, not for killing, but to disrupt the central network long enough to sprint the open ground, something that breaks their rhythm." Martha's eyes snapped toward a derelict bus overturned near the cliff edge. Its gas tank, though punctured, might still hold fumes. "The generator at the station is running on a high-octane mix. If we had a trigger and a catalyst," Martha trailed off, then pointed at my sledgehammer. "The bus's engine block. A sudden, massive, concentrated shock wave. It won't be quiet, but it will be localized and fast." The plan was a suicide mission in miniature. I would crawl to the bus, locate the engine block, and at Elias's signal, hit it with the sledgehammer. The resultant sonic shock would momentarily paralyze the silent ones, allowing us to sprint across the open road. I left my acoustic gear with Martha. Listening here was a liability. I needed pure focus. I stripped off my outer jacket, leaving myself in a thin shirt, and began to crawl into the miasma. The silence was absolute again, broken only by the pulsing hum that felt like a heartbeat. The air was heavy, choking. I moved along the concrete divider, smelling the metallic scent of their passage. I could feel them nearby. I didn't hear the tapping. I felt the slight, rhythmic tremor in the ground through my knees and palms. They were so close. I reached the bus, a massive cold slab of metal. I located the rusted engine block, a solid core of cast iron. I waited, my breath shallow. Time stretched, thick and painful. Then, Elias's signal. 3 soft, distinct taps on his shotgun stock, barely audible. I reared back, drawing the heavy sledgehammer over my shoulder. I brought it down with all the strength and desperation I possessed, aiming for the heart of the engine block. BOOM! The sound was not just loud, it was painful. A raw, metallic shriek of percussion that tore through the miasma. I felt the shockwave rebound through my bones, momentarily blinding me. On the road, the tapping instantly ceased. A collective, high-pitched whine, the sound of the fungus network overloading, ripped through the blackness. Go! I heard Elias's roar, faint but clear. I abandoned the hammer, scrambling back to the road. Elias and Martha were already sprinting toward the switchbacks, but the paralysis was short-lived. Behind me, the whining stopped and was replaced by a furious, chaotic clatter. Dozens of taps, sharp and angry, converging on the source of the sound. I sprinted, running blind. I could hear Elias firing his shotgun, a dull, muffled thump followed by the impact of buckshot. Martha screamed my name. I hit the rise of the switchbacks and crashed into a solid, unmoving object. It wasn't Elias, it was a silent one. Its body was rail-thin, covered in the tight, papery skin. Its head snapped up at the collision. For the first time, I saw the fungal eyes clearly. Twin clusters of pulsing, pale green light, like toxic moss glowing in a cave. The creature shrieked, not a vocal sound, but a rush of pressurized, wet air and a high-frequency hiss that overloaded my senses. The hiss was immediately answered by taps all around us. I reacted instinctively. I thrust my palm into its glowing face. The pain was immediate and searing. The fungus was aggressively hot, like touching a coil of live wires. The creature recoiled, giving me a half second. I grabbed a jagged piece of rebar sticking out of the hillside. I swung it back, aiming for the neck. But the silent one was fast. It ducked, and the rebar ripped through the fabric of its tattered shirt, exposing a horrific, pulsating mass of fibrous tendons and fungus that had replaced the original tissue. It brought its long, clawed hand down in a rake across my chest. I felt the tear of fabric and the fire of deep scratches. Elias was suddenly there, pushing me aside. He leveled the shotgun and fired at point-blank range. The thud was muffled, but the damage was not. The silent one was thrown back, slamming into the hillside, its fungal eyes popping like overripe fruit. It collapsed, twitching, then went utterly still. Move! They're coming from the south now! Elias gasped, pulling me up. We scrambled up the steepening slope, following Martha, who was somehow still carrying her heavy pack with fierce determination. Behind us, the tapping was a frantic drumbeat, and the sound of dry claws scraping stone was getting closer. We reached the technical school gate, a heavy steel barrier set into a chain-link fence. The air here was slightly cleaner, above the densest layer of the miasma. The magnet building, Martha pointed, already fumbling with a lock-picking kit. It's separate, reinforced concrete. They were testing the containment. Elias stood guard, his shotgun sweeping the darkness. Faster, Martha, I hear them tapping below. The lock gave way with a soft click. We slipped inside, bolting the door behind us. The MRI containment room was a vault. The single emergency light fixture cast a sterile white glow on the massive silver cylinder at the center of the room. The MRI machine. It looked like a giant futuristic cannon. The magnet is in the core, Martha explained, her voice tight with excitement and panic. It's encased in titanium housing. We need to detach the housing, then remove the neodymium itself. It's huge. It's going to weigh a ton. We improvise, I said, stripping the blood-soaked shirt from my chest and wincing at the deep, burning lacerations. I could feel the metallic scent of the fungus on the claws. I checked the wounds quickly. No black fluid, just blood. I was still me. We set to work. Martha had brought cutting tools and a spool of thick industrial rope. I located the housing schematics on a dusty wall panel. The core was held by 6 massive bolts. Elias guarded the door, nervously watching the vents. I took the largest wrench I could find, and Martha joined me with a smaller one. The bolts were heavy. Clank! Clank! Scratch! The noise was terrible in the confined space, but the thick concrete walls absorbed much of the shockwave. We worked with frantic speed, the sweat and dust mixing into mud on our faces. Martha was focused, explaining the sheer power we were handling. This magnet is strong enough to rip all the metal out of your body. We have to secure it with the rope before we fully detach it. If it swings free, it'll tear this room apart. One by one, the bolts groaned and came free. Bolt 4. Bolt 5. As I twisted the final massive nut, the entire titanium housing gave a soft thunk, settling slightly. Martha quickly looped the heavy rope around the core and secured it to a reinforced floor anchor. We had stabilized it. Now for the impossible part, extracting the magnet. Just as Martha finished securing the rope, the emergency light above us flickered and died. The room plunged into absolute crushing darkness. The magnetic core, now fully detached, began to hum, a physical internal vibration that quickly rose to the pitch of the parasitic hum. I heard Elias cry out, "They're here! They've cut the power line outside. The generator's dead." The massive steel door began to groan. It was the heavy, blunt force of the Silent Ones slamming their bodies against the thick metal. Not tapping this time, pure, unadulterated rage. "We're trapped!" Martha yelled over the metallic shriek of the door bending inward. "Arthur, the magnet! We have to move it now!" The problem was visibility. Without light, we couldn't maneuver the core. I fumbled for my covered lantern, but before I could find it, I heard a terrible, wet sound. Elias firing the shotgun blindly into the darkness near the door, followed by a grunt of pain. "They're on the ceiling," he bellowed. "They're trying to climb through the ventilation." My mind raced. Darkness was their ally. But the magnetic core, it was pure, immense power. It was radiating the 19 hertz hum, attracting them like a beacon. I found the magnet's central control panel, a thick, reinforced box mounted on the wall. I knew the magnet was cooled and contained by a liquid helium chamber. I also knew that the sudden depressurization of that chamber would cause a massive, violent expansion of gas and a corresponding magnetic pulse. It would be catastrophic, but it would buy us time. "Elias, Martha, get behind the structural pillar, now!" I screamed. I located the emergency coolant valve and ripped the reinforced cover off with a crowbar I'd salvaged. I jammed the bar into the main release valve and twisted it with all my strength. The sound was instantaneous and terrifying. A deafening, high-pitched escaping gas. The magnetic core began to vibrate violently, throwing off a magnetic field spike that made every piece of metal in the room ring like a church bell. Then, the boom. The core bucked against its rope anchors. The door, which had been flexing inward under the assault, was suddenly slammed outward with impossible force, tearing the hinges clean out of the frame. The Silent Ones clinging to it were thrown like rags against the concrete. The entire room was bathed in a sudden, brilliant flash of white vapor and a high-pitched sonic shockwave. I threw myself behind the pillar with Martha and Elias covering my ears, even though the sound was already gone, replaced by a ringing, agonizing silence. When the white vapor cleared, the door was gone. The entire wall was shredded, metal twisted and fused by the immense chaotic magnetic pulse. The Silent Ones outside were still. The sound had killed them. Not the noise, but the magnetic shock that had fried the parasitic network inside them. "It's free," Martha coughed, pointing a trembling hand at the magnetic core. The titanium housing was partially ruptured, exposing a dark, dense, rock-like chunk of metal. "That's the neodymium." Elias, nursing a deep cut on his arm, looked at the magnet, then at the gaping hole in the wall. "We didn't just get a magnet, Arthur. We got a weapon. Now we have to drag this 30-pound anchor of metal back to the station, and we don't have much time." We were injured, exhausted, and the blast had certainly announced our presence to every Silent One within a mile radius. But the core was ours. The sonic weapon was now possible. We began the grim task of securing the magnet, using the rope to haul its dense, silent weight toward the lighthouse path. We knew the silent ones would be massing, drawn by the residual magnetic signature and the violent silence left by the blast. The race against the hum was on. The walk back to the lighthouse path with the neodymium magnet was a nightmare of agonizing silence and physical strain. The magnet, dense and awkward, weighed heavily on our shoulders. We took turns dragging it, wrapped in Martha's salvaged rope, the thick strands cutting into our hands. The metallic smell of the fungus on my chest scratches intensified, a constant, sharp reminder of my near exposure. The hum had shifted again. It was no longer a frantic, localized shriek. After the violent magnetic discharge, the 19 hertz signal had coalesced into a powerful, steady, and dangerously loud throb. It was like the network had rebooted, clearer and more focused than before, now broadcasting a clear hunting rhythm. The tapping was back, too. It wasn't the scattered patrol now. It was a unified, marching beat coming from the dense miasma below us. The silent ones were converging, drawn by the residual magnetic energy of our cargo and the clear command signal of the hum. "They're following the vibration," I whispered to Elias, my throat dry. "They know the sound of the magnet. We can't stop for long." Elias, favoring his injured arm, nodded grimly. "The old maintenance road. It cuts straight up the cliff face to the lighthouse. It's too steep for them to swarm us, but we'll be exposed." We reached the base of the cliff path, a narrow, serpentine track carved into the rock, covered in loose shale and slick with black, oily residue from the miasma. The lighthouse stood above us, a stark, black silhouette against the churning sky, looking less like a beacon and more like a tombstone. We began the climb, the weight of the magnet forcing us to use every muscle. The rope strained and groaned with every upward pull. Halfway up, the hum intensified, vibrating the very rock beneath our feet. I stopped, putting my ear against the cliff face, then pulled away quickly. "They're climbing," I rasped. "They're using the verticality. They're coming up the cliff face below us." Elias secured the rope around a rusty anchor and took point, shotgun held ready. Martha scrambled ahead, looking for a bottleneck. We heard the terrible sound before we saw them, the rapid, dry scrape of claws on shale, followed by the agitated, low chirp of the fungus. 3 silent ones crested the path below us, their movements spider-quick, their luminous eyes instantly finding the magnetic core we were hauling. They moved with a disturbing, joint-popping urgency, drawn to the powerful energy signature. Elias fired. Thud. One creature staggered, its gaunt body absorbing the buckshot like tough leather. It didn't fall, it just chirped louder, more frantically. The other 2 scrambled past it. "They're too resilient," Elias shouted. "They're protecting the parasite in the chest cavity." I dropped the rope and grabbed the heavy magnet, using its sheer, unyielding density as a shield. The first silent one lunged, its fungal eyes burning with malevolent light. I didn't hit it with the magnet, I used the magnetic field itself. As the creature closed, I swung the dense neodymium core in a brutal arc past its head. The massive magnetic field hit the creature's already sensitive nervous system like a hammer blow. It didn't make a sound. It merely froze, its limbs locked mid-lunge, its body twitching with a fine internal tremor. I slammed the magnet into its chest, aiming for the parasite's nucleus. The sound was a dull, sickening crunch. The creature went slack and slid down the path, utterly dead. But the second one was on me. It leaped, landing on my back, its claws sinking into the fresh gashes the first one had given me. The fire was instantaneous. I could feel the fungal tissue beginning to cling to the exposed wounds. I screamed, a raw, desperate sound that was immediately smothered by the miasma. Martha, without a word, was suddenly there. She didn't use a tool. She tore one of the coiled copper wires from her pack, jammed one end into the residual power socket of the damaged magnet, and whipped the other end around the creature's face. The silent one convulsed. A high-pitched hiss tore from its ruined mouth, and a faint blue spark crackled around the wire. The residual current from the magnetic core was enough to act like a low-voltage electroshock. The creature fell, its movements now clumsy and uncoordinated. "Go! Get the magnet up!" Martha yelled, standing over the twitching creature, using the copper wire like a whip to keep its claws away. Elias and I hauled the core up the remaining few yards to the lighthouse platform. We crashed onto the cold, salty concrete, lungs tearing. When we looked back, Martha was gone. The creature was still there, twitching and clawing the ground, but she was nowhere in sight. Then, from the darkness below, we heard a sound that was not a tap, not a chirp, but a single anguished gasp, followed by a horrific gurgling silence. Elias didn't need to ask. He gripped the shotgun so hard his knuckles turned white. "She bought us time, Arthur. Don't waste it. Move!" We rushed inside the base of the lighthouse tower. The door was heavy, steel riveted, and sealed. Elias used a piece of rebar as a lever, and with a terrible shriek of rusted metal, we forced the door open. Inside, the lighthouse was a vast, echoing cavern of stone and metal. Salt spray coated everything. The engine room was in the sub-basement. We descended a spiral metal staircase that groaned under our weight, the sound deafening in the internal silence of the tower. The room smelled of old diesel and brine. At its center sat the original Class A foghorn engine, a massive multi-cylinder diesel beast designed to power the air compression needed for the horn. It was a mechanical relic, dormant for decades, but perfectly preserved. "This thing is designed to run for days without stopping," I said, stripping the final layers of tape from my brass lantern. The light seemed comforting in this enclosed space, though I knew the fungal eyes could see it. If we can get it running, we'll have the power to feed the acoustic pulse. Elias went to the engine, checking the oil and the massive flywheel starter. "I know engines. We can prime it, but the horn chamber is the problem." I looked up. The giant acoustic horn, made of heavy bronze and shaped like a colossal gramophone, was mounted high in the tower, its bell aimed out over the ocean. "We need to climb the tower," I confirmed, setting the neodymium magnet down near the engine block. "We need to install the magnet in the transducer array in the horn chamber. That's what will turn the mechanical noise of the horn into a focused ultrasonic weapon." We worked in a frantic, desperate rhythm. Elias focused on reviving the engine, checking the fuel lines, and cranking the massive starter handle. It was heavy labor, but his fear was focused into brute strength. I took the magnet and the cutting tools, starting the slow, agonizing ascent up the metal staircase toward the horn chamber. Every step was a metallic shriek, echoing through the empty tower, a beacon for anything that might be climbing after us. At the base of the horn, 70 feet up, I found the transducer housing, a reinforced cavity of steel and bronze where the compressed air turned into sound waves. It was a massive diaphragm ready to vibrate. I worked quickly, cutting the steel anchors that held the original mid-frequency voice coil. The metal screamed under the grinder. I stripped the titanium housing from the neodymium core, exposing the raw, dense chunk of magnet. My hands were bleeding from the climb, the wounds on my chest throbbed, and the hum was still pressing against my skull. I installed the neodymium magnet into the core of the housing, the massive piece of metal barely fitting. I ran the thick copper coils I'd salvaged from the police station, winding them tightly around the magnet, securing them with steel clamps. This was the weaponized transducer, the electromagnet that, when fed a current, would amplify the mechanical horn sound into a deadly, high-frequency pulse. I ran the power cables, thick, shielded lines, down the side of the stairwell, securing them to the railings. They were long enough to reach the engine room below. I descended, hands shaking with exhaustion. Elias was sitting slumped against the engine. "It's primed," he whispered, wiping a smear of grease and blood from his cheek. "It'll turn over, but we only get one shot. If it stalls, we don't have the strength to crank it again." I connected the power cables to the engine's main generator bus. "It's connected. When we start the engine, the copper coils will charge the neodymium magnet. It will turn the physical vibration of the horn into a focused 30,000 hertz acoustic pulse." 30,000 hertz, Elias repeated, a morbid curiosity in his voice. "We won't hear it, but they will. We'll feel it," I corrected. "It'll be agonizing for us, but for them, it will shred the fungal network, kill the parasite, and hopefully save what's left of the hosts." Just as I finished the connections, the steel door at the base of the tower began to thud. Slow, rhythmic, probing. "They found the tower," Elias said, hauling himself to his feet. He picked up his shotgun, checking the 2 remaining rounds. I looked at the engine. It was ready. We needed to be on the upper platform to activate the final sequence, the clutch that engaged the compressor and sent the pulse through the horn. "Go, Elias. I'll try to buy you time on the stairs." I grabbed the crowbar. "Negative," Elias said, his voice hard. "You're the engineer. You run the pulse, I'm the blocker. He didn't wait for an argument. He turned, facing the stairwell. The thudding stopped. The metal staircase suddenly began to sing with a high-pitched, metallic chatter. The silent ones were inside. They were climbing. Elias sprinted to the base of the stairs, raised his shotgun, and fired his last 2 shells straight down the dark, spiraling cavity. The muffled thuds were followed by the wet thump of falling bodies. "Go, Arthur! Climb! Start the engine now!" he screamed over the rising metallic chatter. I threw myself at the massive flywheel starter. I cranked it with every ounce of muscle I had left. The engine sputtered. It coughed a cloud of black smoke that briefly filled the room with the smell of old fuel. The engine caught. The room shook with the violent, powerful rhythm of the diesel engine coming to life. The lighthouse was breathing again. I didn't look at Elias. I ran for the stairs, the sound of the engine a shield and a countdown. I had to reach the top platform and engage the clutch before the silent ones reached the engine room. As I climbed, the sound of the engine roar was deafening. But underneath it, I could hear a different sound. The furious, non-stop tapping of the silent ones as they scrambled up the stairs toward me, drawn by the agonizingly loud hum being generated by the charged neodymium magnet below. I was running toward the weapon, but also running straight into the ambush. I looked down one last time, catching a glimpse of Elias standing at the base of the stairs, holding the crowbar. He was not looking at the silent ones, he was looking at the engine, guarding the heart of our weapon. I kept climbing, the sound of the engine and the drumming of their claws, a terrifying, singular sound that meant only one thing. The final reckoning was here. The sound of the lighthouse engine was a churning, rhythmic scream that filled the entire tower. It was the sound of hope, but also a siren, and it was driving the silent ones into a frenzy. I scrambled up the narrow, spiraling staircase, my body aching with every movement. My chest felt like it was on fire where the claws had torn me, and the hum from the charged neodymium magnet below was a pressure cooker headache, agonizingly amplified by the metal structure around me. Below, the metal stairs drummed with the frantic percussion of the silent ones. They were moving in packs now. Their communication network, the 19 Hz hum, was driving them with singular focus toward the source of the magnetic dissonance. I glanced down, catching a final horrifying glimpse of Elias. He was at the base of the stairs, crowbar raised, a lone, exhausted sentinel. He wasn't fighting the horde. He was fighting the engine, shielding the starter and the fuel lines with his body. He slammed the crowbar against the head of the first silent one that lunged, but the pack was too large, too fast. They swarmed him. I heard a muffled, choked cry, then the sound of dry claws ripping fabric, followed by a wet, sickening silence. He's gone. The thought was a raw tear in my mind, but I couldn't stop. I had to make his sacrifice matter. I burst onto the upper observation deck, the air cooler and heavy with sea salt. The massive bronze foghorn loomed before me, its bell aimed over the black miasma that suffocated the town below. The vibrations from the newly installed neodymium transducer made the whole chamber hum like a massive, tuned instrument. I ran to the main control panel, the original brass controls for the foghorn compressor. It was simple mechanics. Pull the lever to engage the clutch, sending compressed air through the transducer array. I grabbed the lever. It was seized with rust. I pulled, straining my exhausted muscles. It wouldn't budge. The sound of tapping exploded from the staircase opening directly behind me. They had reached the top. I turned. There were 5 of them. Gaunt, papery bodies, luminous green fungal clusters blazing where their eyes should be. They moved with a horrific synchronized twitch, their long clawed fingers tapping rapidly against the metal railing. A terrifying, final countdown. I knew the ultrasonic pulse would be agonizing to me, but it was the only thing that could stop them. I had to engage the horn. I abandoned the lever and focused on the weakest link, the control rod connecting the lever to the clutch assembly. It was thin and brittle with corrosion. I used the only weapon I had left, the rusty crowbar I had been carrying. I jammed the end under the control rod and heaved, using the railing as leverage. The silent ones lunged. The closest one shrieked, its jaw hanging open to reveal teeth coated in black fungal threads, its claws scraping toward my face. Snap! The control rod broke. The clutch instantly engaged with a loud, grinding K thunka. The foghorn roared. But it was not a roar I could hear. It was a sound that existed entirely outside the human frequency range. The chamber instantly flooded with an invisible, agonizing force. The 30,000 hertz acoustic pulse hit me like a physical blow, a pressure so intense it compressed my lungs and drove the air from my body. My vision warped. Every nerve ending screamed. I felt a searing, drilling pain deep inside my ears, behind my eyes, and through the burning scratches on my chest. It felt like my very bones were vibrating apart. I collapsed, writhing on the cold stone floor, but the effect on the silent ones was immediate and catastrophic. The 5 creatures froze mid-lunge. Their furious tapping ceased. They didn't fall, they violently imploded. The high-frequency pulse tore through the fungal network like a targeted radiation burst. Their bodies seized, thrashing violently as the parasitic tissue was incinerated at the cellular level. The luminous green fungal eyes exploded into puffs of black smoke. Their skin blistered and peeled away, revealing the destroyed, shredded muscle and nerves underneath. They were instantly horrifically turned into desiccated husks, collapsing onto the platform, their arms locked in a final agonizing spasm. The pulse continued, driven by the massive diesel engine below. I could hear nothing but a high-pitched internal scream, but I knew the weapon was working. The ultrasonic wave was blasting out from the horn, washing over the town of Oakhaven. I dragged myself to the edge of the platform and looked out. Below, the black miasma began to thin. The ultrasonic pulse radiating outward was somehow disrupting the fungal spores and the air they relied on. The black veil began to lift, peeling back from the streets of Oakhaven like a massive rotting curtain. And as the light of the pre-dawn sky hit the town, I saw the true damage and the aftermath. Everywhere, the fungus was retreating. The black growths covering the houses shriveled, collapsing into dust. The thick, oily residue on the roads evaporated, and the silent ones. Dozens of them, scattered across the streets, were motionless. They lay slumped against cars, huddled in doorways, and collapsed mid-step. They were no longer twitching or tapping. They were dead husks, dried out by the sonic weapon, their heads shrunken and their fungal eyes reduced to ash. The 19 hertz hum, which had been the sound of my nightmare, was gone. The engine's low, powerful churn was now the only sound. I waited until the light was bright and strong, until the sonic pulse had been washing over the town for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a desperate burst of adrenaline, I crawled back to the controls and located the engine kill switch. Click. The diesel engine stuttered, gasped, and fell silent. The lighthouse was plunged back into a profound, normal silence. A silence that was not the miasma's sensory vacuum, but the absence of sound after a terrible violence. I waited, listening. I didn't hear a tap. I didn't hear a chirp. I didn't even hear the faint residual hum. I heard the sound of wind, a clean, refreshing rush of air off the ocean, rattling the rusted railings of the deck. And then a sound I hadn't realized I'd missed, the high, thin cry of a seagull. The parasite was dead. The silence was broken. Oakhaven was quiet. I descended the spiral staircase, dragging my crowbar. The air was cool and clean. I didn't find Elias's body. The only evidence of the final struggle was a section of the staircase railing bent inward, covered in black ash, and a pair of dark, stained, heavy boots resting at the bottom. He had given his life to keep the engine running. I walked out of the lighthouse and looked at the town. The black fog was gone. The sky was a pale, hopeful blue. Oakhaven was a town of corpses. Every figure caught by the miasma, the silent ones, were now shriveled, desiccated remains. They were human in outline, but nothing more than dusty shells. I walked the streets, looking for any sign of life. I passed the remains of Mr. Davies by the bank, Mrs. Peterson by her mailbox, the others from town. All had paid the price for the parasite's network. Finally, I reached the police station. The door was still barricaded with the low-grade Faraday cage. I shouted, "Sam! It's Arthur! It's over! The pulse worked!" A long, agonizing moment passed. Then, the barricade shifted. The steel door creaked open just enough for a face to peer out. It was Sam, the gas station attendant. He was pale, shaking, his eyes wide and red, but he was alive. "The engine, it stopped," he whispered, his voice trembling. I thought they won't find us now?" I pushed the door open, stepping into the cramped safe space. I smelled the copper, the stale air, and the fear. "They won't find anyone, Sam," I said, dropping the crowbar. It clattered loudly on the floor, a pure, normal sound. It's quiet now. It's truly quiet. I sank onto a crate, looking at the silent street outside. The horror was over, but the silence remained. The silence of death, of sacrifice, and of an entire town wiped clean by an enemy that commanded sound and darkness. The engineer in me was triumphant. The man in me was broken. I had saved the region, but I was the last man standing in a graveyard, the sole survivor of a war fought against the sound of silence itself. I closed my eyes, listening to the clean, crisp sound of the wind, the cry of the gull, and the rapid, pounding rhythm of my own heart, the only human drum that still beat in Oakhaven. And for the first time since the miasma arrived, I didn't hate the noise. I embraced it. It was the sound of life and the sound of my survival.